president of Sarasota World Affairs Council. I think I know most of you by now after 6 lectures. I'm happy to see you all back, and it's been an exciting season. So tonight we have a very timely lecture on the Palestinian-Israeli dynamics, conflict dynamics. I should mention also in passing that our previous lectures are recorded, and this one I believe is being recorded tonight. Yes, it is. Okay. And they're on our website. So if you missed a lecture or want to go back and see a lecture again, I think you'll find it on our website.
It will be on our website.
Will be on our website. Okay, I got ahead of myself. Bear with us as the operative language here. Okay. I think I don't want to take any more time because we really have a very interesting lecture tonight, and I want to have our program director, Lynn Partington, introduce our speaker tonight. Lynn, it's all yours. We'll have the usual Q&A after this.
Welcome, everybody. I would like to apologize that our scheduled March 7th lecture had to be canceled due to a health emergency of a family member from General Clapper. So we hope that schedule, we can reschedule that in the near future and you'll be notified. Which brings me to a point, and I want to emphasize about, because I receive questions from time to time, although SWAG takes a pause during the summer months, SWAG membership is based on the calendar year. So if you've enjoyed our lectures these past few months, but have put off becoming a member because you've been thinking it's all over, it's not. You have your membership, $100 a year or $125 a couple, is valid until the end of this coming year, which will be at least 3 lectures, and and also, of course, the not to be missed reception. So we look forward to getting to know all of the SWAG members, all of our new SWAG members tonight, and all of our SWAG members. So if you are interested in joining, we'd like to welcome you. And if you're already a SWAG member, but you haven't renewed your membership yet for 2023, I won't call out your names, but please renew as soon as possible. Because with rising costs about just everything, we really do need your support and your contribution in order to maintain the programming quality that we've worked so hard to achieve. Just a couple of other notes for those who missed our January and February lecture on Ukraine. They're now up on the website. So, and also there are some books from last month's lecture on Ukraine from Ambassador Yovanovitch and Dr. Angela Stent out in the lobby. And so if you would like to purchase one of those, because you didn't miss them last time. So now let's talk about this evening's presentation. Tonight's speaker comes to us from the United States Institute of Peace. Such a soothing name, United States Institute of Peace. So reassuring. Imagine if there's even an institute for it. So now imagine being the courageous, and I must say optimistic applicant who agrees to sign on as the director of Israeli-Palestinian conflict program at the United States Institute of Peace. Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen did just that, and tonight she's here to provide us with a better understanding of the conflict in the region, which has continued now for some more than 70 years, and so to try to answer some not easily understood basic questions, such as who's fighting who, why are they doing that, and most importantly, when are they going to stop? She's up to the task and uniquely qualified. With graduate degrees from Georgetown University, she previously worked with the US Department of State as an Arabic language specialist. She's fluent in both Hebrew and Arabic, and is the program officer for the Kennedy School of Government's Middle East Initiative at Harvard. She managed work on the Israeli, Palestinian, and Saudi Arabian portfolios. There will be a Q&A after her remarks, but please keep your questions brief and to the point. So right now, let's give a warm Sarasota welcome to Lucy Kurtzer.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that very kind introduction and for reminding me that I've set myself up for long-term job security with the issue I work on. I'm sorry, as I'm fiddling around over here, just getting my laptop out. It's a pleasure to be, can everybody hear me? Do I have the mic there? It's a pleasure to be here in Sarasota. I was mentioning last night to Lynn that this is the second time I've ever been in Sarasota. It's beautiful. The first time was about 25 years ago when my parents almost moved here, and we came down and we saw where they were going to live. And it, nothing to do with Sarasota, that ended up not happening. They moved to Chicago. And I love Chicago. But I have to say, after experiencing the weather here the last couple of days, this probably would have been a more appealing regular place to visit, weather-wise at least. So anyway, thank you very much for warmly welcoming me here. I actually couldn't think of a time that's more active and illustrative of the challenges to resolving this conflict than now. Anybody following the news is seeing, certainly most recently, Israel specifically in the news. And while that news right now is focused on domestic turmoil over domestic political issues in Israel and is not directly related to the conflict, I would suggest that there are trends that have been pushing towards what we're seeing right now that are not unrelated to what we're seeing play out in the conflict and the challenges to resolving it over the last number of years. And we're going to talk about some of those trends as I see them and the implications this evening. I think looking at the title that I picked, it's the closest maybe indication of if I were to say I have a thesis of this talk. This idea when I say old conflict and new dynamics, this idea that I think it's very easy to look at this conflict and think that it's, whatever metaphor you want to use, Groundhog Day on a rinse and repeat cycle. Haven't we been seeing this same set of dynamics for year in, year out? And to some extent, yes, but I think for as long as this conflict has persisted and the drivers of it have remained unaddressed, and the societies themselves and the world itself has changed around it, either in reaction to or in spite of the conflict has evolved and it raises new questions about the road to resolution and where we go from here. So there's a lot to cover. I know what an impressively engaged and knowledgeable crowd this is. So what I'm not going to do this evening is try to attempt a sort of a one-on-one overview or history of the conflict. I'm going to start us off with where we are right now and speak to the current dynamics, trying to ground them in some trends that I see have led us to this point. And of course, there will be many questions I'm sure you'll have that I don't get to in my comments, and I look forward to engaging with you during the discussion. So this is just a roadmap, a sense of where I'm going or hoping to go in my conversation today. I'll tell you a little bit about my organization, then talk about recent developments, look at the trends, look at the implications, and then, as I said, looking forward to your questions. So the views and perspectives and analysis I'm sharing today are my own, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the organization I work at. As Lynn mentioned, it's a lovely and inspiring name, the US Institute of Peace, and that's the context in which I engage on this issue on a professional basis daily. The USIP, US Institute of Peace, was established by Congress, and it was actually signed into law in 1984 by President Reagan as a national, nonpartisan public institution dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. It is, as I said, nonpartisan. We have a Senate-confirmed, fully bipartisan board. And it represents the US's enduring commitment to peace. And why we say that is the idea of the Institute was actually, and I love this, it was first suggested by George Washington, the idea of an Institute of Peace. And it was finally established, as I said, in the 1980s, but after many years of advocating for that largely by a group of senators and members of the House who were veterans who fought in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and wanted to invest in the idea of showing the world that the US can be dedicated to peace, democracy, and prosperity. And one of the other components of our history that I love is this notion that many of these veterans said, we spend so much money as a country, invest so much in learning how to be the best at prosecuting war. We have our military academies. Shouldn't we have also a peace academy, a place in which we invest in knowing how to prevent those wars and manage violent conflict when it breaks out. So we're fully federally funded. Our headquarters is on the National Mall in Washington. We're very close to the Lincoln Memorial. For any of you, when you're next in Washington, please come by. It's an impressive looking building, an inspiring building. And our building itself, we convene across political, ideological lines, convening trainings, dialogue, roundtables. We hold exhibitions, conduct research. And in addition to that research and convening that takes place in Washington, we also have field offices in 16 countries. The last point I'll make on this before moving into the substance of my talk is our engagement on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Arab-Israeli affairs, I believe, is our longest sustained engagement at the Institute. Not without understandable reason. We've been working on this in the various ways that we work that I mentioned for quite some time, and at least maybe during the Q&A I'm happy to talk about some of the ways we do that and what that looks like as well. This slide is very deliberately densely packed. The substance in it, the information I want to convey is more impressionistic, which is, let's look at how much has been going on in just a short period of time in the last 5 months. We'll talk through some of the details, so don't worry about digesting all of them. But I started this timeline, and again with conflicts, where you start a timeline itself can be very meaningful, right? So this is not in any way to suggest where the start of the conflict was. This is just a snapshot of the last 5 months to convey just how action-packed it has been with events that hold bearing not just on Israeli and Palestinian domestic affairs, but also on Palestinian security, Israeli security, US regional security interests, and the potential for the parties and international actors, including, of course, the US, to be able to move the needle in a constructive direction. In November, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, won re-election. It wasn't immediate re-election, but he had already served as the longest-serving Prime Minister in Israel after he stint as Prime Minister in the 1990s and then a very long stretch in the 2000s. And Israel went through in the last 4 years, 5 elections. It's been an incredibly tumultuous political time. And in this, after a year out of power in the opposition, he was once again given the mandate to form a government. He came in, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as I go through the talk, bringing in the furthest right-wing governing coalition that Israel has had. And among the priorities on the agenda was ushering in judicial reform. This is what you're seeing a lot of in the news recently. This brought the Israelis out in the streets in numbers that have not been seen for some time, possibly ever. I'd have to look at that. But hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis across the political and ideological spectrum have been out in the streets protesting against judicial reform. Most recently, Netanyahu has put up, he's postponed moving forward with that. Again, we can talk more about that in detail. But all of this has been happening amid the backdrop of record levels of fatalities and terror and violence. Fatalities of each side to the other. So record number, since the UN started tracking these numbers in about 2005, the last couple of years has seen the most Palestinian fatalities at the hands of Israelis and Israeli fatalities at the hands of Palestinians. This situation was already causing the US administration to pay a lot of attention. And I say that because this is an administration, I think if you were to ask me what was its goal when it came into office in relation to this conflict, I think it would have been to not get too heavily involved and to help maybe keep things as calm as possible, but to not get heavily drawn in, because as we'll talk about later, I think it's an administration that's seen that there are other priorities globally, and perhaps priorities they thought they had more chance of seeing some success with. But needless to say, when the level of violence started going up, you've seen 4 or 5, I think, senior level Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, President was out there, members of the National Security Council heading out to the region. There was a meeting that the US convened with Jordan and in Jordan, and in partnership also with Egypt in Aqaba in February in an effort to de-escalate the rising violence. that was happening. And this was particularly happening in and around Jerusalem, but also in the northern part of the West Bank. We'll talk about those dynamics. Within a day of that meeting ending, there was yet another uptick. There was a terror attack in the West Bank, in a town called Hawara, a shooting attack that killed 2 Israeli brothers. That then, shortly after that, a group of violent extremist settlers went on a rampage in the town in Hawara in West Bank in an unprecedented show of violence that the Israeli security authorities themselves and leadership referred to as a pogrom. This was just taking things to a level that had not been seen before. So this was within a day of a meeting held to de-escalate tensions. There was a follow-on meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, there's one soon to follow, where the Israelis and Palestinians who have been sitting across the table from each other just focus right now on trying to keep things as calm as possible as we hit this period that we are directly in. Ramadan started beginning of this week, 23rd, so beginning of this week, I've lost track of the date, or ended last week. Pesach, the Jewish holiday of Passover, is to start next week. Easter will come in there too. This has traditionally been a very fraught time, particularly in Jerusalem, particularly around holy sites. The goal, if you'd have asked the American administration and the parties themselves back in November, would have been, as we lead up to this point, let's see what we can do to keep things calm. And you can already see that calm is probably not the description that is most apt for what we're looking at right now. The other pieces I've mentioned in there for us to keep an eye on, I put the Negev Forum Summit in January. Many of you remember or recall from the news back in August of 2020, the announcement of in September, the signing of in 2020, the Abraham Accords, so regional normalization agreements between certain Arab states, the Emirates, Bahrain, then Morocco and Sudan with Israel. And many have questioned, again, something I keep saying we'll talk about a little bit more, can they withstand any deterioration in the Israeli-Palestinian arena? Back in January, you had a summit of the Negev Forum, which was an outgrowth of the Abraham Accords. It includes Egypt, a summit of working groups of these countries trying to come together to create joint projects in various spheres. That continued amid this turmoil. There was supposed to be a follow-on one in March. This is now not an updated not an updated slide, but Morocco so far has postponed. It is not yet scheduled that meeting, and I think most likely because it's incredibly hard to move forward with some of this cooperative work, the more the situation deteriorates on the ground. So this is a sense of some of the dynamics at play. How did we get here? What is behind these dynamics? I would posit a series of trends that I've listed here, and I'm going to go through. And we're going to start with what is happening in the Palestinian sphere and Palestinian politics. Palestinian politics are divided, and between there's two ruling polities. Basically, the West Bank is ruled by President Abbas, who's the head of the Fatah party, and Gaza is ruled by Hamas. This dates to basically 2007. It was essentially a civil war between these two factions, primary factions in Palestinian politics. Fatah was essentially run out of Gaza, and since then, this has been the situation. So you have this divided polity already. The US and many allies have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, so they do not deal with Hamas or engage with them. So whenever we've heard about efforts of negotiations between the Israeli and Palestinians, the negotiating partner on the Palestinian side has been President Mahmoud Abbas. However, he's almost 2 decades into what was supposed to be a 4-year elected term. And so what that means is, in terms of popular legitimacy, it is completely absent in terms of how the Palestinian people have any faith in his ability or credibility to move them in a positive direction. Because of the divided polity, you will often hear people on the Israeli side, you'll hear from the Israeli government and you'll hear from Israelis, how can we come to a two-state agreement, a two-state solution agreement, and negotiate a peace agreement with a side that, with a leader who only represents part of his public or is only part of the polity. And that is one of the questions that you often hear when the Israeli side will talk about how there's no partner for peace on the other side. Now, this is a mirror image situation. You'll also hear the Palestinians talk about how there's no partner for peace on the Israeli side. And again, we'll be talking about both sets of dynamics. But the Palestinians feel very disaffected by their leadership on both sides. If you look at the polling, I think in the West Bank, it may be across the board actually, West Bank and Gaza and Palestinians, I think it's something like over 70% of Palestinians would say they would like to see President Abbas resign. Why am I focusing on this in this context? I focus on this because what it means is President Abbas as a leader feels very little ability to make tough decisions that require hard compromises, because it's going to be very hard to bring his people behind him in that context. There are those who have accused, again, you'll hear another argument on the Israeli side, is that, well, don't we also have a situation where a Palestinian leadership has been either nodding to or endorsing or not cracking down effectively on terror or incitement. Despite that argument, the Israeli security assessment, when you talk to Israeli security officials, they'll actually hold that despite many of the flaws and reactivity of President Abbas, he's been consistently committed to a nonviolent approach to this conflict for many years. And that has actually been demonstrated by cooperation, particularly on the security front, with the Israeli security forces. There's been sustained Israeli-Palestinian security coordination for many years. The challenge is the longer that this conflict has gone unresolved, the further away the Palestinian public feel they are from achieving a state. Increasingly, that security cooperation is very, very unpopular with the Palestinian public. They see it as a form of a collaboration with their occupier. They see it as a way of Israel, the occupying force subcontracting out their own security. This is the perception among the Palestinian public. And what that means is that the Palestinian Authority has really lost a lot of control, and actually effective control, in large parts of the West Bank, particularly in the northern West Bank. You might have heard, if you've seen the news of rising violence, you've seen particularly sites of these flashpoints in the refugee camps in Nablus and Jenin, where basically young people mostly have taken up arms to themselves rather than relying on the Palestinian security forces. So this is some of what is fueling the disaffection and the violence that you've been seeing on the West Bank side. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong one. When it comes to Israeli politics, I mentioned that you have the furthest right Israeli government that has been in power. Right and left, I should say, in Israeli political terms, let me just take a moment to explain what that means, because it doesn't map entirely squarely the way right and left might in the American political context or in the European political context. Typically and historically, when Israelis have self-defined as right-wing or left-wing, it's been a proxy for where they situate themselves in relation to security issues, and most particularly in relation to, again, historically, hawkish or pieces in relation to compromise in relationship to Palestinians and pursuit of a two-state solution. Israel, over many years, I think at this point, close to approximately 60% of the Jewish Israeli population will self-define as right-wing. And the second marker of right-wing self-identity in Israel is also increasingly, not fully, it doesn't squarely map, but religiosity. So this is a growing religiosity among communities in Israel, and largely speaking, the more religious the community, the more likely they are to identify with right-wing. And what you see right now is a coalition in Israel that has brought together a coalition of religious parties, Netanyahu's Likud party, and then party members who are really at some point were considered historically beyond the pale within the Israeli political system. Folks like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, who are from really the far right of the Israeli spectrum and are part of the coalition currently. Many of those in that coalition have been pushing this legal reform. We were talking about judicial reform for various of their own interests. They have different reasons for wanting this legal reform to move forward. But where I would say it does have bearing on the conflict dynamics between Israelis and Palestinians, in the case of people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, one of the things they are most interested in, they are affirmatively not interested in a two-state solution. They are affirmatively interested in expansion of the settlements, legalization of currently non-authorized settlements, and expansion of territory into the part of the West Bank that would be part of a Palestinian state if a agreement was signed. And the Supreme Court, in their mind, they would say, has been a blocker of the ability to do many things over time. This judicial reform in Israel right now is an effort to change how the Supreme Court is able to act in relation to laws of the past. In Israel, there aren't really three branches. The legislative and the executive branch essentially are the same. So the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, has essentially been the check on laws that are passed. And the concern of those out in the streets is that if the judicial reform goes forward, you end up with majoritarian rule by pushing through these reforms. So again, while this isn't all directly related to relations between Israelis and Palestinians in the future of the conflict, it will have bearing and implications on it. Meanwhile, zooming out, there is a changing regional picture. I mentioned the Abraham Accords signed in 2020. For many years, there was a paradigm that held, framed by something called the Arab Peace Initiative that was put forward by Saudi Arabia in 2002. And the Arab Peace Initiative was an offer that the Saudis put on the table that was signed on to by the League of Arab States and then also OIC countries, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that said, we will normalize relations with Israel at the point at which the Palestinians get a state, the conflict is resolved along the lines of a two-state solution along the 1967, sort of the armistice line, the 67 border. And at that point, when that happens, but there are other stipulations as well, with a capital for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, at that point, we will normalize relations with Israel. And that was a type of leverage that the Palestinians had as well, this backing they felt they had from the Arab and broader Muslim world as well. Egypt and Jordan obviously had already taken this step forward. Egypt signed a peace agreement at the end of the 70s with Israel. Jordan signed one with Israel in 1994. But with the Abraham Accords, here you see President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you see the Bahraini and the Emirati foreign ministers. This was really a diplomatic achievement with game-changing potential, but it was not, unlike actually the agreements between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel, it was not a peace agreement that ended a state of war. Let's remember, these countries have never been in a state of war with each other. And in fact, what it did was it ended the Arab Peace Initiative conditioning paradigm, right? What it said is, okay, we're going to go ahead and normalize ahead of achieving this two-state solution, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state living side by side. But what it did not do, these states have not, while doing that, disavowed their goal of seeing a two-state solution eventually be the way that this conflict is resolved. Many have asked, could this create new leverage? Could now having the Arab states normalize Israel, does this create new leverage to help them more constructively push this conflict towards resolution? I think that remains to be seen. What we've seen so far is that these states, again, the impetus for these agreements was not about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It was about a whole other set of interests, particularly security interests, shared view about those security threats in the region, Iran specifically, the worldview of Israel, the Emirates, others in the Gulf, who shared the same concerns about Iran as a security threat. And also what these agreements did, it's important to recognize, is really bring out into the open dynamics that had been happening under the surface for years. There had been security and intelligence and other types of sharing and cooperation over time. But the Abraham Accords formalized this in the case of some countries. For Netanyahu, when he came back into office in November, he stated as a goal that his goal is to bring Saudi Arabia into that fold. What we've seen on that timeline I had before is actually most recently a surprise move. Saudi and Iran just signed a reconciliation agreement brokered by China, which has many other implications as well in terms of considering great power competition and the implications of that in the Middle East. But all to say, you now have a situation where potentially there is new leverage, right? This is a conflict where an asymmetric power imbalance where Israel is the stronger party in relation to negotiating with the Palestinians, but for many years the Palestinians felt they also had the support of the Arab states around them. The one thing to keep in mind when the Abraham Accords were signed is that the Emirates, in moving into signing those Abraham Accords, had as a condition, at that time Netanyahu, who was prime minister then at that time, had been pledging that he was going to, in the wake of the plan that the Trump administration put forward for resolving the conflict, Netanyahu said he was going to annex large amounts of West Bank territory. There was an international community outcry against this. Again, this would be seen to put an end to what being considered a consensus view of being able to resolve this conflict one day along the lines of two states. And the Emirates, I think, saw an opportunity. And what they did is said, if you don't annex, we will offer normalization now, rather than along the Arab peace initiative paradigm. So what the Emiratis will say is, we actually did something affirmatively for the Palestinians. We prevented annexation, we preserved the potential for a two-state solution to be negotiated. From that point on, I would argue the Emirates have not had an interest in affirmatively pushing further forward to push the parties to the table or do something more constructive than that. There's a lot of relational dynamics at play. There's a lot of tension in the relationship between the Emiratis and the Palestinians, a lot of geopolitical dynamics that don't make this as easy as now that we have these countries on board. Could some progress be made? But suffice it to say again that you are beginning to see, as things get more tense in Israel and the right wing is flexing more power, you are beginning to see more concern registered by some of these countries. And I think the question that some are having is, what will this do to Netanyahu? And in fact, the US has stated a goal of wanting to deepen and expand the Abraham Accords arrangements. And this is just to say that one of the reasons that the US arguably stepped back from playing a robust role in this conflict for many years, and indeed the rest of the international community, is there has been a lot of other things going on in the world that has been drawing attention away from it. The one thing I always say about this conflict is we, the US, I think, can try to turn away, but it has a way of putting itself back on an administration's agenda, and particularly as we saw in that timeline at the beginning, when violence flares, the world ends up coming in, typically led by the US, to play the firefighting role. And what would be wonderful if there were all the resources and bandwidth in the world for an administration would be if we could get to a point where we were addressing the flammable material along the way. So we weren't constantly having to come in a firefight and bring things back to a stable norm and starting from zero each time. But what tends to happen is violence will flare, agreement will be made to bring the temperature down, and then it's just a matter of months or time, and that's the key drivers have been addressed until those flashpoints flare again. This slide is just shown between the war in Ukraine, Iran. The threat of Iran, we now know that Iran is on weapons grade, is almost weapons grade enrichment level with uranium. This is something, again, this threat of Iran was something that had brought Israel already together in common goals with its Arab neighbors. Great power competition concerns in the region alone. There's been the ongoing war in Yemen. The economy in the Middle East has suffered deeply, significantly as well, because of the war in Ukraine. And so all of these things have just been dividing and distracting the attention of the usual actors who have typically been third-party mediators in this conflict. I've mentioned the two-state solution a lot. And again, this is a conflict that when the petition plan, Resolution 181 of 1947, the UN petition plan that resulted in the creation of the state of state of Israel. That petition plan itself really envisioned a type of two-state conflict. It envisioned a state of Israel next to what was described as an, at that time wasn't said as a Palestinian state, it was a Jewish state and an Arab state was what was laid out in the Resolution 181. But again, a type of two-state solution. And since then, ever since the US certainly has been playing a robust mediating role, the end goal vision has either implicitly been, and finally it was made explicit, was the idea that this conflict could only be sustainably resolved if a Palestinian state was created and you had two states living side by side in peace and security. In the heyday of the peace process, the peace process in the early 90s, right after the Oslo Accords were signed, some of you may remember that famous handshake on the White House lawn, President Clinton bringing Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat together. Right around then, this timeline starts much later, but the support for peace and the enthusiasm among the Israeli and Palestinian publics for a peaceful solution was fairly high. It is remarkable how dynamic public opinion is and how it responds to positive developments. This again, this chart now really goes to 2018, and these numbers now dip much lower, but what I wanted to show you again visually here is you see the plummeting of support on both the Israeli and Palestinian side for the concept of a two-state solution. There are many reasons for that. Again, I think the longer the conflict has persisted, the more attempts there have been that have failed to see success. The rounds of violence, particularly before this slide, it's remarkable it went back up, but the Second Intifada was a brutal time for Israelis and then also for Palestinians. And I think that one of the challenges I see today when you look at youth attitudes on both sides, which have definitively hardened, is that the memory of that intense violence of the Second Intifada is not a memory that this new generation has. I think the older generation remember that time as a time that they definitely do not want to return to. The younger generations, we did a poll, my organization in partnership with an organization called the Alliance for Middle East Peace. We did a poll of Israeli and Palestinian youth 15 to 21 years old. And concerningly, what you see in that generation, the attitudes are so much harder line towards each other than in their parents' and grandparents' generation. It's strong zero-sum attitudes of it's either all ours or, it's either you get it or we get it, but there's no room for compromise. A complete rejection by both sides of the legitimacy of the other side's historic claim to belonging to the land. So again, this is a real challenge generationally now, as you see time move on, with youth just feeling their parents' generation have failed them, and there has been no movement forward. The traditional flashpoints, I'm just looking at them for time, for a check on time, because I know we started late, so we're okay. Jerusalem is consistently a flashpoint, and I mentioned at the beginning of my talk the convergence of Ramadan, Pesach, and Easter that is coming up, particularly when it comes to Ramadan and Pesach. This area that you're seeing here, often referred to in English as the Holy Esplanade area for Muslims, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque is up there, it's Haram al-Sharif. For Jews, it's Har Habayit, it's where they see the site of it's the Temple Mount. And since 1967, when during the end of the 1967 war, when the Israelis when the Israelis ended up in control of the eastern part of Jerusalem and the old city, it had been under Jordanian control. At that point, the story that always that resonates with me historically, Moshe Dayan, who was the Israeli general at the time, when the Israeli troops entered into the old city, he saw one of, I think, the paratroopers start to put an Israeli flag on this area. And Moshe Dayan right away said, take that down. We're basically going to start a holy war if we do this. The status quo will hold. What is meant by the status quo, there's this term status quo you often hear in relation to Jerusalem. It's status quo with a capital S and a capital Q. It's an arrangement that it's really been a modus operandi that dated back to Ottoman times, I believe. And it was an arrangement whereby the Jordanians have custodianship over the holy sites up there. Muslims pray, non-Muslims can visit under the status quo arrangement, but not pray. And the idea of, when Moshe Dayan made that decision, and why successive Israeli prime ministers, including Netanyahu himself, has said when committed to upholding the status quo, the notion has been that in this conflict cauldron, this is an important way to keep the peace. This is such an important holy site that has resonance and significance to populations around the world. And often around this time, what you're seeing as well, I mentioned, you've seen an uptick recently in challenges to that status quo arrangement. More and more certain Orthodox Jewish communities, many actually won't go up there, they believe they're forbidden by Jewish law, but there are certain Orthodox Jewish communities who increasingly have been going up there wanting to challenge the status quo and pray. It's something that's being pushed very strongly particularly by Itamar Ben-Gvir, currently one of the ministers in the Israeli government. And this is one of the concerns you've been hearing leading up to this period of the overlap of these religious holidays. The concern is that while Muslims are out there praying, particularly during the last 10 days of Ramadan, if you have observant Jews coming up to try to pray in observance of Passover, are you going to end up with a conflagration? And that's what a lot of these de-escalation efforts and security coordinating conversations have been about. Another flashpoint we hear about a lot is Gaza. Gaza has really, I think, played host to a series of successive wars and a cycle of war, fragile ceasefire, reconstruction, war, fragile ceasefire, reconstruction. And of course, for the international donor community, the increasing challenge is when you have that kind of cycle, people are reluctant to invest because they don't know how long their investment there is going to last. Gaza, Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. So it is in a different status in relation to Israel than, say, the West Bank is. But with Hamas in control and other groups there like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others who have not renounced the right, what they say is the right to all forms of resistance, including violent resistance. It's a constant thorn in Israel's security side. I, in my page of contents at the beginning, talked about intertwining flashpoints. And what I mean by that is May 2021, some of you may remember, was another time of violent flare-up. And why this was unprecedented, or different, I would say, than times before. Hamas typically has gone to war, has sent rockets in relation to trying to achieve needs and goals within Gaza, more reconstruction, more materials in, try to gain the edge there. When things started heating up in Jerusalem in May 2021, again instigated very largely as well by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who wasn't in the government at that time, Hamas for the first time, I would say, took up the resistance mantle in the name of Jerusalem. And what Hamas said is, if the following happens in Jerusalem, we will send rockets. Now, go back to what I was saying before about the disaffection of Palestinian public with Mahmoud Abbas, and the sense that Mahmoud Abbas has largely been committed to a non-violent approach to resistance. What happened is Hamas, I think, seized an opportunity with the disaffection around the violence in Jerusalem and really took on the mantle of the resistor and defender of Jerusalem. And what you began to see is for the first time Hamas playing a role in what happened here in Jerusalem as well. This also led for the first time in years to fighting, like very intense fighting between Jewish citizens and Arab citizens in Israel in the streets around this time, also galvanized by this fear of a siege of Jerusalem. And it was at the time, the president of Israel at the time, Reuven Rivlin, described it as being concerned that Israel was on the brink of a civil war. That was very strong language he was using at the time. You're hearing people now use that again today in relation to what's happening on the streets in relation to the judicial reform. But as you can see, this is what I would call a new front. You now have several fronts of concern in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm trying to find an optimistic note in all of this to provide you as I've laid out the challenging dynamics. And I talked about this youth poll that USIP did along with the Alliance for Middle East Peace. This slide to just pull some of the not so great news and takeaways. This was a 2020 poll. We're actually hoping to renew this and do an updated one to see what the trend line is. But again, some sobering findings. Each side believes that violence is the only or best way to achieve concessions from the other side. Again, these are 15 to 21-year-olds. Just about half believe a political resolution can actually bring peace. Majorities reject each other's national and historic connection to the land. Support for two states in decline, we saw that. Any points of hope? Well, minorities, look at this bubble top, minorities on both sides consider cross-border engagement illegitimate. That's a strangely phrased framing. But what I take from that is, basically we poll to see, how do you feel about the engagement with the other side? Is it legitimate under some circumstances, fully illegitimate? You know, there is a strong trend of boycotting and anti-normalization sentiment among the Palestinian public of not wanting to engage with Israelis. Only minorities said it was fully illegitimate and they would never do it. So for those of us who are engaged in the business of finding avenues for constructive engagement, under the right circumstances, there may be an opportunity to bring people in. Palestinian youth respect Judaism and Jewish citizens of Israel respect Islam. There was mutual respect for each other's religion. So again, where does this provide some opportunities for engagement, maybe particularly through a lens of religion or religious engagement? And majorities on both sides believe peace is possible between ordinary people and the conflict is mostly about leaders fighting for their own interests, which I thought was another interesting takeaway. Again, a poll is a snapshot, right? You have to look at it in context. But you know, for those of us trying to find opportunities for engagement, it's good to know where those opportunities may lie. Options and implications for this. You see here again, we see some of the key leaders involved in this. I think we are at a point. We've been hearing many for years. John Kerry, during the last round of active negotiations under the Obama administration, you might have heard John Kerry many times say the door is closing on a two-state solution. This is the last chance, the door is closing. There are many who will say, didn't it already close? How will we know when it's closed? Hasn't it been closing for years? The answer to that is not clear, but what is clear is you now have an Israeli leadership, the current Israeli leadership, Netanyahu, who says he doesn't support two states. You have developments on the ground moving in a direction that will increasingly make it hard to create those two states again. Remember, this current Israeli coalition, you have a real push for expanding settlements, legalizing new settlements. And what that means is each time that happens, that's more land that from the Palestinian perspective is what they want for their Palestinian state, and that would be subject to negotiation of a two-state solution. So the more that land becomes under Israeli control, the less land there is for Palestinians to feel that they would have a viable state at the end of the process. You are still hearing the international community, and I use that term broadly, I think it's a term that I think resonates for all of you, what that typically means, but the US and under this administration continues to say two states is the end goal, is the political horizon. The question is, what will we and the international community, what can we do, what would we do to ensure that can still happen? I think that while you have seen leaders withdraw from active engagement and robust engagement on this, is a sense that you have two leaderships, Israeli and Palestinian, who aren't serious, who are in no position to successfully negotiate towards this end. So we, the US, the international community, don't want to invest time and resources in something that we see as a non-starter. So we've set as a goal as an administration mostly let's see what we can do to keep things stable and to preserve the potential for two states. Increasingly, I think people are saying, well, what comes if two states isn't possible, then what? Aren't we currently in essentially a one-state reality in the way the situation is playing out right now. But increasingly, you're hearing people play with new ideas such as confederation ideas. That's a new one that's come up a lot. Increasingly, this notion of, is there a confederal solution that would enable the parties to deal with developments as they have taken hold on the ground and still have some degree of autonomy and self-determination for two peoples, but with some kind of shared authorities engagement. There's increasingly a lot being written about it. We're doing a project looking at it at USIP, trying to understand what would that look like comparatively. Are there situations in the world where this has worked? And what would have to happen to make that a workable, sustainable solution? But again, people are now starting to think about a post-two-state solution concept. People have asked, as I said, can the Abraham Accords provide some hope in this regard? So far, as I've said, the Arab states seem to have been reluctant also to dive in and do something particularly heavy-handed to move this conflict towards resolution. Again, I think a lot of these parties share the disillusionment with the Israeli and the Palestinian leadership. But these are shameless promotions for USIP pieces, by the way. These pieces on our website, some of my colleagues. But I ended before with those youth poll slides and the willingness or potential for engagement. These pictures actually happen to be from work being done by USIP partners over time. People often, when they think about people-to-people work and people-to-people engagement, it often gets caricatured as, well, isn't that nice? Isn't it just kids going to summer camp together or eating hummus together? Or isn't it just hummus and hugs, and does it really do anything? What I would say is, it is a field that has really developed over many years of engagement, and is doing some very serious work at the grassroots level on a series of planes, whether it's in the educational sphere. This picture on the right is from actually a grant project that we had supported that was it was training security, training the police, educating volunteers, putting together a community council on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, which is an area where you have a lot of different religious equities, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian. There have been a lot of tensions up there for a while. So in an effort to calm tensions and build relationships, this was a holistic program put together that trained the police on different religious sensitivities and brought together the heads of the different religious institutions for the first time to engage in dialogue with each other regularly. There is a lot of work like that. At the end of 2020, the United States Congress passed something called the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. And for the first time ever, it was a robust investment. It was $250 million over 5 years, a bipartisan passed bill to invest in Israeli-Palestinian people-to-people work of this type. And it was modeled around something that was done for Northern Ireland, the International Fund for Northern Ireland, that's starting, I think about 12 years before at least the Good Friday Agreement was signed, was investing in civil society. The idea behind this is it's now it's in year 2 of investment in these organizations. And the idea is, even if we have political leaders who are not able to come to the table, don't you have to prepare the ground for peace? Don't you have to get the publics on board, build some bridges, build some trust to enable those leaders to make some tough decisions going forward? I would say, I mentioned before that public opinion is dynamic. One of my favorite polls, this was another one that USIP supported back in 2013. It polled the Israeli and Palestinian publics on if there were to be a political agreement, would you support this type of agreement? And it had components of what one might imagine could be an agreement that would be signed. And my favorite part about the poll finding, and I wrote about it in this piece at the time, is that when the pollster went back to those who said, on both sides, who said, I would absolutely not accept this peace deal under any circumstances, they went back to each side and said, okay, the other side has signed on. What do you do? And on both sides, supports jumped by 10% on each side. So what that tells me is that public opinion is dynamic. I don't mean to underplay how difficult this is, but what we have seen consistently at a time when there has been diplomatic progress or there is something positive going on, it does affect quite rapidly where the public's attitude is towards peace and reconciliation. Again, I look for glimmers of hope where you can find it. I do see peace building as a long-term proposition. And so I will end, again, another shameless promotion for USIP here, but Senator George Mitchell is the gentleman you see here. He came to speak at USIP back in 2017. We did an event looking at comparative Northern Ireland conflict and investment in grassroots there and Israeli-Palestinian. And he said peace agreements such as the Good Friday Agreement don't make peace, they make peace possible. And his whole point was that the signing of the paper is one thing, it's the people on the ground who are going to have to sustain that peace agreement, but arguably as well, and it's also something he talked about in relation to the International Fund for Ireland, we're at a point, I think, in the Israeli-Palestinian context where to get the leaders, it's not just that you need people to sustain the agreements made by leaders. I would argue that there is going to need to be a push coming from the grassroots on both sides to get their leaders to make some of the tough decisions. And if you saw the kind of people power you saw out in the streets in Israel with the judicial reform in the last few days, if you could imagine, you could see that kind of people power on both sides. Pushing their leaders towards some tough compromises for peace. That would be the goal for me one day. On that, I'm going to close and open to your questions, and I look forward to discussing with you. Thank you.
Okay, do we have some questions from the audience?
If indeed the present situation is that minorities of each side,
Oh, sorry, thank you. Yes.
that less than 50% of either side wants a two-state solution, what does each side envisage as a one-state solution?
You have asked the million-dollar question, and in fact, when you pull, what I didn't add when talking about those statistics is that when you pull both sides about, okay, two-state, how about one state, how about again confederations, and you one pollsters have started to poll about, two-state still gets a plurality of support in relation to all the other options. So given all the other options, two states gets more support, but it is well under half the population. And the reason I think is implicit in your question, which is the idea of one state could mean many things. There are those who would support and would love to see and advocate for a fully binational, equal rights, one state. That is not a majority of those supporting that, and I would argue that with the history of this conflict and the interests of both sides, that's not a plausible outcome. And this is, there is a reason that there was that we ended up with a petition plan in 1947, and people have been pursuing two states since then, because the idea of getting the publics living together, equal rights under one state, just seems very implausible and unlikely, particularly if you think about the levels of trust that would be required for that to happen. They're not only not there, level of trust between the two sides is declining. What you see get higher support is a more concerning type of one state, higher support on both sides, which is one state with unequal rights for the other, right? One state in which I have majority control. And so this is why I think the international community is using continues to say two-state. And if you listen, I found it very careful. I was a linguistics student, so very my graduate work was in discourse analysis. So I overly parse language and discourse here, but I found it very interesting to listen increasingly. And I think there's been a shift when President Biden and when the Secretary Blinken was out in the region. The line the administration keeps repeating is along the lines of, we are working towards there being equal measures of prosperity, security, dignity. I forget, it changes over each time for both sides. And we believe that the best way to achieve that is two states. But it's almost a dialing back of we're pursuing, we have a goal of how we want these people to live. We leave it open. Maybe there's some other way. We believe that the best way is 2 states. And again, until recently, I would say the language was, but it's going to be up to the parties. We can't do that heavy lifting for them. And in some ways, if we go back to the Trump administration, Trump was the first American president for many years to throw open this idea. Right? I think he said, 1 state, 2 state, I like whatever the parties want, was his sort of much repeated phrase. He eventually put forward a plan that effectively he even framed in terms of 2 states, even though it by no means met any sense of a kind of 2-state formula that would have been acceptable on the Palestinian side. But again, this is the question you ask is exactly that. What would 1 state possibly look like that could be workable and sustainable? And again, the publics on the ground don't share a view on what that kind of 1 state, I would call it an outcome, not a solution. And I think arguably you're seeing that playing out currently.
I'm sort of, you've answered part of what I'm talking about, but the issue is that Israel is currently ruling undemocratically over the Palestinians, and we see the very unequal treatment of Jews and Palestinians. Is the fact that they do not have a constitution part of what creates this inequality?
So I would say those 2 issues are separate, but the implications have bearing on each other. So what I mean by this is, so as you know, part of the challenge right now with the judicial reform is that Israel doesn't have a constitution. It's had a series of basic laws. And so when it comes to figuring out balance of power, what Netanyahu and those pushing the reform would say is we're just trying to correct a balance where checks and balances are fine, but it's swung too far the other way, and the Supreme Court has been overly activist the last number of years, since the 90s, and is shooting down the will of the majority. Now, where the Supreme Court comes into play in relation to the occupied territories is that the Supreme Court has been, this is one of the situations where those on the right in Israel will say the Supreme Court has just been a lackey of the liberal left peace camp. And the Palestinians and Palestinian Arab citizens in Israel will actually say, well, we'd actually have liked to have seen the Supreme Court rule a lot more in favor of Palestinian rights. The Supreme Court has quite frequently blocked attempts legislatively to either legalize settlements, or things like home demolitions that happen. And that is, I think for Israelis, one of the things I think was very instructive. When the protests started certainly in earnest at the beginning of this year, when protesters first came out in the street in Israel against the judicial reform, as I said, it's actually brought together in a way you haven't seen in Israel, right and left, across the political and ideological spectrum, secular, religious, the whole gamut. One of the first major demonstrations was a group that showed up with a Palestinian flag, supporting sort of Palestinian nationalism, and the organizers of the protest said, that has to go. If we're going to find common cause, basically the idea being that that issue is going to be so polarizing that we have to focus on this issue. And I think what I would say is, I think for Israelis, I think for many that look at this from the outside and say, well, doesn't this majoritarian impulse relate directly to a situation of continued control over the territories? I think for many Israelis, they see these as different issues. They will see the Palestinians define it as a security issue, and will say we have no partner of peace on this side. Again, the Israeli narrative, again, I'm generalizing here, but a narrative on this is we have no partner of peace on the side. We offered, there have been various attempts at negotiations. Yasser Arafat walked away and we got the second intifada in Gaza. We withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, and we've had these rockets. So would we love to live in peace? Yes, but we just don't have a partner on the other side. So that's where you get the dissonance, I think, of Israelis who will say, this is important for Israel's democracy here, to not push judicial reform, to make sure we have checks and balances on a Supreme Court that we think, that the Supreme Court is important to uphold and maintain our democracy. But let's not confuse this with a security situation that we have on the other side of the territories. So just what I'm pointing out is the framework within which this is often seen or not seen of the side, which is what makes this, again, with any conflict narratives, I often find when the tragedy to me, and I use that term of this conflict, so this is the case of many conflicts, right, is that each side, if you listen to their narratives, it's almost mirror images of the other. Each side believes they're victim to the other, that they have no partner for peace on the other side, that the other side only wants to destroy them. The list goes on, and it's through that lens and framework. And I would almost say, I often talk about, there's actually an Israeli, long-time Israeli negotiator who's once used a term which resonated with me. He said, it's actually not negotiation, it's therapy that both sides need. It's like bringing together two traumatized peoples, and that's what plays out at the negotiation table. And you almost need someone who brings a sort of a therapeutic eye to the negotiation context to better understand how to break through these narratives. So I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, but just tend to.
Two questions. The first is, I'm sure you saw Tom Friedman's column over the weekend calling Netanyahu an irrational leader.
Yes.
Who's vowing to turn Israel into a Jewish Turkey or Hungary. And so, what's your opinion on that? And the second question is, did Trump's move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem help at all?
Okay, so on the first one, and I think something that you point to that Tom Friedman has pointed to, and this is, I think, about the third or fourth, maybe more, that Tom Friedman's written about this issue over the last few months, very seized by it. I think, this description and analogy to Turkey, I think what you're seeing, again, what's happening domestically in Israel with Netanyahu, I see as part of this global movement that we are seeing reverberations of in many places, right? It's a growing illiberalism, and again, a growing impulse towards this question of, what's will of the people, and is it majoritarian rule a form of democracy, and where's the role of minority rights in a democratic context? And so I think you're seeing that squarely playing out here as well. I think it is part of a similar, if I can call it, strongman trend. And I also think that it's important to keep in mind here that Netanyahu has a lot of personal stake in this judicial reform as well. We have to remember, and maybe I'm talking at a time of resonance in terms of developments everywhere, but Netanyahu's been indicted. He's on trial for fraud and bribery. The Israeli legal system moves very slowly. There's nothing fishy about how slowly it's been moving. This is just the pace of the Israeli legal system, but he's on trial, and it hasn't escaped the attention of many analysts that this judicial reform, the way he would want to push it through, would enable him to still serve in office, and not because it didn't fit, because he's on trial, and perhaps be able to ensure judges who are more sympathetic. So it's very personal, Netanyahu, and I think often I've described it, watching this happen, it's almost Shakespearean to me, just seeing sort of a tragic hero, tragic villain, however you put it, main character, the sort of the meshing of the personal concerns with the political. And the reason I say that as well is Netanyahu as polarizing as it has been for many years, he was always considered, and if you read his, there have been many biographies of him, a fairly cautious character at the end of the day, very savvy politician, fairly cautious at the end of the day. And there are many who are noting he seems to have really doubled down and thrown a lot of caution to the wind here in terms of, if you saw, I think Biden, the President Biden came out with the strongest statement I've heard, a US president make against its ally Israel in many years in relation to this specific issue, the judicial reform.
And the embassy?
Oh, the embassy, yes. The embassy. So this is certainly a thorn in the side for the Palestinians. Every time an American official goes out and he's talked to Palestinian leadership, they feel deeply, deeply, deeply disappointed that the consulate, President Biden, during his campaign, said he would reopen the consulate. That would be one of the things he would reverse of Trump-era policies. He has not done it. They've restructured. They've essentially put the reporting lines back. And I know you asked about moving the embassy, but where those related, we did two things under the Trump administration. We moved the embassy to Jerusalem. It had been in Tel Aviv. And many of you will know this, but there was congressional legislation that dictated that the embassy should move back in the 1990s, should move to Jerusalem. And basically it had come up, the president got waiver authority and waived that happening time after time. Because while negotiations were happening, the idea is it could prejudice negotiations, it could interfere with foreign policy goals, so Congress let the president keep waiving that decision. Netanyahu, the first time it came up for the waiver, I think it came up every 6 months, he signed the waiver, and that next time was when he said, I'm moving it. Now, if you read, again, I'm going back to the language analysis, if you read the announcement when President Trump moved the embassy, the language says something like, this does not predetermine the final borders of Jerusalem. Again, I'm not getting the language right, which is to be determined during negotiations. So arguably, technically, that has not been taken off the table. The idea that you could have an embassy to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The statement that was made when the embassy was removed. However, very soon after that, you had, I think, starting first with Nikki Haley, who was the ambassador around the time, and then followed by Trump, they kept using this phrase, Jerusalem is off the table. And nobody knew exactly what that meant. But it sounded very much, certainly to the Palestinians, as though Jerusalem off the table means that's it. The America is no longer recognizing that we would like to have our capital in East Jerusalem. So to answer your question, technically, there is a word, if one came to an agreement, if we saw an agreement, a two-state solution agreement, the fact that, America has recognized that Israel's capital in Jerusalem has its embassy there does not preclude also recognizing one day that the Palestinians have their capital in East Jerusalem. So nothing has formally been precluded, but from a symbolic and an atmospheric and a trust-building perspective, for the Palestinians, they saw it as one more sign, especially then when we closed the consulate or wrecked the consulate that was in Jerusalem, that effectively had served as a de facto representation to the Palestinians. When our ambassador under the Trump administration merged that into the embassy, that was seen by the Palestinians as a statement of American policy of, Jerusalem being off the table. But again, technically there's nothing physically and technically about it that would stop an agreement still being able to be made along the lines of two states.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. Earlier in your talk, you spoke about this hardening of views from both Israeli and Palestinian youth. And I want to just hone in on the Palestinian youth side of things. The military court system adjudicates over Palestinian children in the occupied West Bank over issues which the military codes define as falling under security crimes. The range of what falls under security crimes is quite broad, and around 800 children are prosecuted in these courts every year, with a 99.7% conviction rate. So that being said, what are your thoughts on the impact that the military court has in hardening these stances for the side of Palestinian youth?
Look, I think daily lived existence in reality is what is hardening these attitudes. And I think what I said before, what strikes me most when I talk to young Palestinians, and primarily I get to talk to those who are in East Jerusalem West Bank, less engagement with Gaza youth, though some, but more regularly there, is what strikes me the most is a feeling of hopelessness and despair, and as the situation, and as I've said, the feeling that their parents' generation did not push back hard enough, did not fight what they see as the injustices and inequities that they face, and feel that they are going to want to take their own path towards a better future. So these youth attitudes, and again on both sides, they're obviously they're a reflection. There are those who will say don't these come from indoctrination, from social media, from incitement? Yeah, sure, all of that is there. We see that globally as well, and social media has been a big problem when it comes to violence flaring. In terms of these memes and these YouTube videos that get circulated and take on a life of their own. But at the end of the day, daily lived experience is what is impacting the views. I'd say the one thing with social media in relation to the kinds of you're talking about is it's not just about social media, it's talking about the dynamics on the ground. It's sort of an outlet to the outside broader world, so, if you will, and a sense of these youth as if they see what life could look like elsewhere. And they want that, right? They don't want to continue living in a particular reality. So, yes, all of this, I think, contributes to the sense of hopelessness and despair that you see.
A couple more quick questions, and I think you were wanting to say.
Hey, I can't make a quick question. You know, Stan Borg, demographics, which is not the elephant in the room, I guess in this case, the camel in the room. The latest stuff I saw a few years ago indicated that population growth, birth rate in the non-Jewish part of Israel and occupied territories was much higher. And it seems, now, if you use the comparison to Northern Ireland, which one of the factors in Northern Ireland was the increase of Catholics over Protestants, which made them have to negotiate more. And I wonder if the same sort of thing would happen in Israel and the West Bank. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, we go back to why, for years, there were many years, the consensus view of a two-state solution being the way to resolve this conflict is you have a situation where you have two peoples who are pursuing or wanting to achieve their national aspirations as distinct peoples on the same geographic territory. And that's fundamentally, I mean, what it's very fundamentally what sort of the conflict boils down to is two competing nationalisms on the same land and resources. Again, that oversimplifies, and there are other dynamics at play, obviously, but in terms of relation to your question about demographics, is that the impetus for the state of Israel was a state and homeland for the Jewish people, and the idea of, again, in the two-state endgame would be that you would have a state for the Jewish people and a state for the Palestinian people. Increasingly, and this goes to the first question we had about what would one state look like, the increasing with the after 67, the growth of settlements, the more intermingling of the different populations, the harder it has become to divide, the greater the growth of sort of intercommunal, if you say it that way, tensions between the sides. But people will point out that if the goal, and this is where it does relate to what you're seeing in the streets today in Israel, for many years this notion of the Zionist notion of a Jewish state, Jewish homeland, would be both Jewish and democratic. And at what point, if you are ruling over another people, or there are more Palestinians in your state than there are Jews and vice versa. Unless everybody has equal rights, you no longer have democracy. And that is the challenge that we're looking at today. It is the challenge that Secretary John Kerry kept pointing to towards the end of that negotiating period, of that it is in both sides' interest, to his mind, for us, while the door is closing on two states, to preserve each side's, justifiable goal and aspiration for safety, security, self-determination, that is in both sides' interests to come to agreement among two states. The forces today on the Israeli side and those on the Palestinian side, let's say, Hamas and others who have not accepted the goal of two states, they don't feel hidebound by this need for it to be democratic, right? Their attitude, this is where the zero sum comes in. I think there are those extremist forces on the Israeli side who will say what's important first and foremost is that it's Jewish, secondary is the democratic piece. And the other thing I will go back to the slides. I will physically go back to, but one of the findings in that youth poll that was interesting, that the youth on both sides, the one thing they agreed on, but in relation to their own societies, I think 90-ish% on both sides, Israeli Palestinians said democracy is important to them, which was interesting. Again, where you wrote that, what the implications are of that, and they're talking about them within their own societies. And we didn't talk about, when I talked about Palestinian politics, the democratic backsliding, the lolling governance and growth in authoritarianism on the Palestinian side is also part of Palestinian youth's daily experience and why they're so disaffected with their own leadership as well. So all these dynamics come to play. This is again why it is. The longer these drivers aren't addressed, I think I'll say one last thing on this. You often hear, it drives me a little bit crazy when people say, we just need to return things to the, if we can just, if nothing else, if we can't move forward right now, let's just maintain the status quo. And there is nothing static about this conflict. There is nothing static about the dynamics on the ground. And the longer we go without addressing the drivers fueling it, there is no such thing as, again, status quo here with a small s and a q. And I think that's why people like me and others who work on this, at much different levels than I do, with much greater engagement, and those particularly Israelis and Palestinians who I'm privileged to get to meet, who work on trying to come to a peaceful solution, they recognize this, and it's really for their sake, right, that we cannot assume, they cannot assume that status quo is a thing in the context of this conflict.
Last question,
Given that the status quo is deteriorating and that both sides believe there is not a viable partner for peace on the other, at least currently, if they were asked, and I suspect they've been asked, if we could put the question of a viable partner aside for a moment and just ask the broader hypothetical question, if we could have such a partner, do you believe that reaching an agreement would be in the long-term best interests of your people? What would they answer?
What would the people answer if they were told that would a diplomatic agreement along to a two-state agreement be in again, I think I think if you asked today, I don't know what that answer would be, and the reason I'm hedging this way, I'm not just hedging because I don't know. I go back very much to this notion that public opinion is dynamic, and I have often read into this decline in support for two states. What I have often read in this, it's very hard with the poll. Again, I know I've referred to polls a lot, but I'm very aware that polls are just a single data point. And I think you never know what people are hearing and what context they're bringing to a question, and what extent a declining support for two states is an affirmative ruling out of that being a desirable political end goal, as opposed to an acknowledgement of despair that it's ever really going to happen. Right? What are the chances we couldn't possibly have come to agreement with these people? So no, I don't support it, it's pie in the sky. We don't know how to pass the different answers of do you support two states or not. But as I said, what I do find meaningful is that even there's a gentleman called Khalil Shikaki who we worked with in Alpol. He's probably the most prominent Palestinian pollster. He polls the Palestinian public quarterly, and has done for many years. And it is remarkable to see trend lines change in response to the dynamics that are happening on the ground. So I think that I spent a lot of time talking about people power and investment in civil society, and that's a lot of what I work on. But I also believe that at the end of the day, peace is made between political leaders. I believe very much that that's not enough, and you need the people to sustain those agreements, and leaders need to prepare their publics. But I also think if you have courageous leadership on both sides who said enough, and we're going to come to an agreement, would you have violent spoilers on both sides? Yes, absolutely. You're never going to have a situation in which there aren't violent spoilers. You're never going to get rid of the violent extremist settlers that you're seeing, the kind who went into Hawara. You're never going to get rid of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas brand of resistance. There will always be those who will have a zero-sum attitude. But I believe that's why it's important to sort of galvanize and mobilize and empower those who are not those extremes, and and the extremes I think are the minority at the end of the day. And so again, I think it's dynamic. I think it needs leadership, and it also needs and that's leadership. The political leaders themselves, Israeli and Palestinian, and I think international leadership as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.